Okay, so now without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Matt Carmichael, editor of What the Future. Matt, you have the floor.
Hey everybody, Jason Pargin, the author of Futuristic Violence in Fancy Suits, and some other books whose names I am not going to mention because they're not very polite. He said that cities are always living in the future, and trends always start in the cities, and not all of them are good. The dual disruptions of soaring cost of living and hybrid work are the reason the future of cities is even a question. And this issue looks at how that plays out in two tension points in particular, neither of which look good for the future of cities. We neither want to live in them nor work in them. Today, 64% say they would rather work from home than in an office, and 74% would be happier living outside a big city than in a city. Regardless, millions of us rely on cities and live near them, if not in them. Between 2000 and 2050, the share of Americans who live in urban areas is projected to increase from an already high 80% to 90%. But that figure was just 5% when the nation was founded and most of our constitutional rules were written. Back then, we were an agrarian economy. Today, 90% of our GDP is generated in urban areas. This, by the way, is what Midjourney thinks our cities look like, and we'll talk about this more in a bit. But anyway, for corporations, all of this has broad implications for your workforces, but also the kinds of products we need to innovate. That's true across industries, as auto companies, office supplies, tech and equipment, packaged good retailers, and even restaurants will have to factor what hybrid life or changing commuting means for our buying habits and the occasions in which we shop and dine. This is all what we're going to cover today. And I'm Matt Carmichael, the editor of What the Future, and this is our episode on the future of cities. Every month, What the Future covers a different topic, and this is actually going to be kind of a nice bookend to how we started the year, or actually ended last year, with the future of work. Today, you're going to hear from 6 amazing experts, from design to technology to urban planning, the auto sector. You'll learn about exclusive new Ipsos research on all of these topics, and you'll get some glimpses into the tensions that will drive us into the future. So let's dive in. Hybridization is often enabled by the digital disruptions happening all around us. In What the Future Play earlier this year, we talked about how gaming has moved from tabletop to electronic to online, and in some cases back again. And play has moved from outdoors to indoors and might do more of that as our climate change. Play was social, then it became somewhat isolated as we played video games alone. And now it's often physically isolated, but virtually social, as we play online with friends or stream to a broader audience. Play didn't say, stop, come back to the playground or the ball field. It said, digital is here to stay. Let's enable that with games that are social as well as tailored to the home experience. And everyone made a ton of money and had a lot of fun. Cities accelerated changes during the pandemic. Streets and downtowns and residential areas alike were closed overnight to cars and open to outdoor dining, walking, and biking spaces. And ideas that used to take years of planning and red tape were executed literally overnight to great success. Some of that has been dialed back since the lockdown ended. But work, on the other hand, hasn't been reinvented to the same extent. Sure, we're doing more of our meetings online and things like this, but we have yet to make all the changes we discussed in What the Future work. And we aren't really thinking yet through new processes and ways of doing things in our hybrid worlds, much as we are in play. But the long evolution of play and the sudden acceleration of trends in our downtown show that work can get there if we do the research to understand the ways in which hybrid can be a benefit to employees, employers, and cities alike. If we truly make hybrid work, future cities could look very different than in the past. But there are 3 other plausible directions that we see in the signals. One is that the future of our cities will look very much like the distant past, when we built cities more for humans than cars. Think of the livable models like Madrid and Copenhagen. Or those with money and power could build new cities from scratch. Several tech titans in California have that in mind as they buy up land. And in Saudi Arabia, a group of investors are developing an ambitious project called The Line, which is shown here. And this is actually being built now. Sustainability is a stated goal of both of those projects, but cautionary tales abound in China, which has ghost megacities dotting its vast landscape. Or while many experts say that hybrid is here to stay, companies are also starting to call people back to the office with greater urgency. So we have to acknowledge that there's a possible future that looks very much like 2019. Changing something as central to our being as where we work takes a huge push like a pandemic, and the counter push will also be strong. To paraphrase urbanist Joel Kutkin, who was interviewed in WTF's transportation issue, never underestimate the power of inertia. So today, we're going to talk a lot about work and hybridization of work. It's hard to talk about cities and downtowns especially and not think about those things. We'll talk through that with a number of experts, including Martin Schwartz, the Global Solutions Architect from HP, and urbanist Gil Penalosa. We'll talk about commuting patterns and how that's changing. And we'll talk about how those changes are impacting the way we shop and the way we live and the way we buy, as well as the way we work, and how our cities are responding to all of that. Those discussions will take place with Hudson Reilly from the National Restaurant Association and Hassani, who's with General Motors. We'll talk about how cities are on the front line of a lot of the problems facing our world today, including climate change, that mayors especially have to deal with these problems in a very real way and deal with them on the front lines, because that's where we live and that's where we want to see these problems addressed, because we see the problems more directly in our own homes and areas. And finally, we'll talk to Kay Sargent from HOK, the big urban designer or architect. And we'll talk about the politics of cities as well, and talk about virtual spaces and what virtual spaces can learn from physical spaces. And as we're doing this, we will always be keeping in mind the Ipsos theory of change, that we think about the macro forces, the huge tectonic plates like climate change, like inequality, that are driving the future and underpinning everything we do. We'll think about the signals, and I'll actually throw in one, hopefully, if I remember, that Kate MacArthur tossed to me today. The things that we see in the news that make us think about the future. And we don't necessarily know what's going to happen, but we can tell that maybe this means something is going to happen. Excuse me. And we don't necessarily know what it's going to be, but our futurist spidey sense tells us that we should be keeping an eye on it. And in the center, we think about the shifts, the changes in society and markets and people, the very human part of foresight. And all of these things interrelate, and all of these are really the foundation for any work we do within Ipsos in trends and foresight. They're the building blocks of those kind of engagements that when you're thinking about the future systematically in a trends and foresight kind of engagement, this is the way we underpin all of that work. So the pandemic changed where many Americans work, or rather, it accelerated change that was already happening. Today, half of our workers have at least some flexibility in where and or when they work between remote and office. More workers in their mid-career are working flexibly. And while there was a reported dip in commuters across urbanicity spectrum, urban workers are commuting almost a full day less on average per week. Nearly 10 years ago, in a previous life, I worked with Richard Florida's team at the University of Toronto to come up with a framework for measuring the livability of cities for livability.com. We developed a split questionnaire fielded by Ipsos, asking people to either rate or rank their ideal location based on a series of criteria. And Ipsos has since run that data nearly every year since, and the results speak to a deep human truth about the Maslowian needs for safety, affordability, and comfort. And this year's results seem to reflect some key topics playing out in our cities, including crime and education, as the crime rate became the second most important thing for people for the first time in the period we've been tracking this. And we see other changes in terms of politics and in terms of the importance of schools and how that plays out across the political spectrum. And with that, let's hear what our expert panel has to say about the future of cities. We're going to start with one of my favorite ideas. And I've presented this concept from urbanism to clients across sectors, and it always lands and inspires the kind of lateral inspiration that what the future is designed for. Because sometimes the simplest ideas are the most revolutionary. So what if you design a city for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old? It turns out it works pretty well for everyone in between. Urbanist Gil Penalosa heads an organization aiming to steer cities away from designing places that mostly only work for 20 and 30 somethings. But if you're thinking, hey, that could be relevant for my business too, you're right. Here's why it matters for cities. The COVID pandemic showed us a lot of things regarding work in cities, and it showed us that many can work hybrid. It showed us that if you want to turn a street into a pedestrian walkway or a bike lane or outdoor seatings for restaurants, you literally can just do it overnight. And it showed us that we're likely to need to rethink cities because a lot of what we have doesn't work. We've had a lot of bad urban design in the past decades. Gil cites projections that the US could need to build 50 million housing units in the coming decades and reshape our landscape. He sees both potential and also responsibility in doing the planning work. The good thing, we now know what works and what doesn't. Here's what he told me.
If these changes are going to be happening in the next 30, 40 years, we should think, what have we done in the last 30 or 40? And the reality is that most of what we have done is not good. It's mediocre, and many of it is very bad. Why? Because it's bad for climate change, it's bad for mental health, for physical health, even for economic development. So it is not really good for anything. So I think the opportunity that we have is also a huge responsibility, because whatever we do or don't do is going to be there for hundreds of years. But I think we could do it right. I think that's why I'm saying that we need to do it radically different. And this is, I think it's a fantastic opportunity.
He talked about how a lot of the most livable cities on Earth and what they have in common in terms of density, and most importantly, a focus on people, which, as we'll see, isn't universal. Now, one of the biggest debates across the future of cities is whether they can thrive if the public doesn't return to offices 5 days a week. The implications for central business districts and tax bases, as well as employers and workers, are huge. Martin Schwartz, a global solutions architect on computer and technology provider HP's Future of Work team, says flexibility and mobility will be key for workers to be productive from anywhere, including the office. This shift means that we need to build both technology and cities to allow people to move seamlessly between places at home and work. The places that enable their mobility must do so in a way that cities can thrive, even without a full return of the workforce. The arrangement companies could choose have far-reaching implications for products and services that rely on downtown office workers, including restaurants, automobiles, and even virtual spaces. Still, Schwartz challenges the notion that many companies will force full return to office policies. But even if they do, two things will drive the future, he says. Quote, the companies that get hybrid right and get flexible work right are going to be the most successful. Now, you could say the same for cities, but what if we do go back to the office more? He explored the idea with managing editor Kate MacArthur.
Let's just say it happens. And yes, we're all back to the office. What changes? Not a lot. You're still going to have some people with mobility requirements. You're still going to have the routine worker types. You're still going to have the knowledge worker types and the specialized workers and the different personas that apply to those. So that's a very broad spectrum of type of use cases. So those won't change even if they're all or many of those go back to the office. There will always be mobility involved in some of those personas. Is it going to be a full 5 days back at the office? If it is, and it's going to be long term, yeah, there might be a change in the type of device you use. Maybe it's more of a desktop-based device or a thin client-based device. So I think it would just be an adaptation. And quite frankly, I think in the future, companies like HP we build out services to be able to accommodate that.
Simply put, he thinks that as our needs change, our devices will need to change with us and be as hybrid and flexible as our work situations are. But our tech needs aren't the only things in flux, and that work flux affects all the other kinds of flux in our life. Where people work and where they live are in flux, which means how they shop will shift too. And what people decide to buy has long been driven by familiar factors like price, quality, and convenience. But there's no standard definition of convenience at a time when some Americans are commuting to the office and others are working from home. Meanwhile, the e-commerce boom has changed people's habits and expectations of in-person and online shopping. And all of these changes are happening in a new era of personalization, fulfillment flexibility, sourcing transparency, and zero-click predictive ordering. As work and schedules change, understanding the who, what, where, why, when, and how of shopping decisions will become even more complex, says Neil Ellison, an SVP in Ipsos's US channel performance practice. He says, the winners will be the brands who get a deep understanding of shoppers' needs and motivations and embrace those changes. Ipsos research shows that older Americans feel overlooked not just in their cities, but also at the store. Only 19% of consumers over the age of 55 feel that most new products are being created with their needs in mind, compared to 41% of consumers aged 18 to 34. And the Census Bureau expects that nearly a quarter of Americans will be aged 65 or older by 2030, making this an increasingly expensive oversight. But the aging of America isn't just a demographic inevitability. It's an opportunity for brands to center inclusive design across their products and services, says Allison Heffernan, a senior vice president in Ipsos's innovation practice. She says, quote, by centering inclusion and accessibility, brands can build trust with shoppers across generations. These principles have unexpected benefits too. Packaging that's designed to be easier to open, for instance, isn't just more accessible, but also less wasteful and less frustrating for all those who use it. And as the 8 to 80 city philosophy that we talked about earlier illustrates, planning for youth and older adults tends to work better for everyone in between. The brands that keep older Americans' needs in mind will develop products that work better for all ages. Cities draw people from workers to tourists who rely on restaurants for meals and entertaining, while restaurants are often destinations in themselves. But the remote work era has disrupted this symbolic relationship, and neither can thrive on one mealtime or occasion. Hudson Reilly, SVP of Research at the National Restaurants Association, says the ultimate fate of these establishments and business practices or business districts depends on their ability to adapt, embrace, change, and cater to the evolving needs of patrons. I really like this chart because it breaks out exactly how many workers have what level of flexibility. And when workers flocked to cities, restaurants from fast food to fine dining thrived from morning to late night. Now that this customer base is flowing to the suburbs and beyond, it's unlikely to return, at least like it was, says Reilly. He says, for decades before the pandemic hit, much of the growth and employment was in the city center areas. And as a result, the restaurant community followed that employment growth and developed a lot of small independent operations in these city center areas. But now you have the opposite occurring. So for now, the communities that surround the cities are booming, but can they survive without the city core being strong? And what happens if employers succeed in forcing workers back to the office 5 days a week? In the future, where will this pendulum land? You can see America's car culture just by looking at how most of its cities designed. Think back to that Mid-Journey image we saw a little bit earlier, right? So when Ipsos asked people about these things that were easy to do where they live, number one answer selected was get around by car. We built our cities for cars, not for people. And hey, I guess it worked. But then when people stopped commuting en masse to cities for work during the COVID pandemic, it gave people a different view of how cities could look if we relied less on automobiles for getting around. And at the same time, automakers like General Motors are working toward an electric future that offers a new role for them as energy providers. This is the focus for Haas Hassani, who leads GM's energy organization as Vice President of Charging and Energy. Two problems facing our cities relate to power and transportation. How do we prop up our aging grid, and how do we move around in cities of the future? Electric vehicles can provide a solution to both. Rather than be a drain on the energy grid, as some people might fear, EVs can be a supplement to it, says Hassani. He says, quote, when people ask that question of how can the grid support all these electric vehicles, we flip this paradigm by saying, how can these electric vehicles support the grid? And that signal I was talking about earlier, Kate MacArthur sent me a clip today about how Vermont, or at least areas in Vermont, are giving batteries like Tesla car batteries to homeowners to help them store electricity so that the grid becomes more stable. And GM is taking an ecosystem-based approach to future transportation by rapidly moving into electrification. Later this year, the company will roll out its Ultimum battery platform that offers bidirectional charging between your home and your electric vehicle, or vice versa, giving EVs a new role beyond transportation. And it's interesting to hear someone from a car company talk about car-free zones or walkability in cities and how those things can coexist. But it shows a recognition of an important fact. Climate policy is transportation policy, and vice versa. Here's what Haas had to say to Kate.
One of the challenges we're facing with EV infrastructure build out is that there hasn't been a shift in the framework, and it still feels very status quo in terms of how money is dispersed and how and when infrastructure can be built out and utility upgrades can be planned. So we're working with utility partners and utilities and companies that support utilities to have them help them think differently about how they should be planning for electrification. We can tell them where EVs are going to be and when they're going to be there and where they're going to drive and where they're going to spend a lot of time. So this coming together of private industry, public industries, utilities, and so forth, is itself going to lead to some new innovations in terms of how all of it gets financed and paid for and supported, while at the same time ensuring customers are always getting maximum value out of a vehicle that they're purchasing, a service that they're purchasing from us.
Haas talks about the funding for electrification, and in the interview, he also talks about how we need that investment in the grid, all of which sounds like a much more future-y way to spend billions in infrastructure money that's currently flowing to the states, rather than building more and wider roads. According to new USA Today Ipsos survey, many Americans think that climate change won't just change how they live, but where they live. From rising temperatures to rising sea levels, more than 2 in 3 Americans think extreme weather events will become more frequent in the near future. And now about 1 in 4 say it will be more difficult to stay in the area they currently live due to climate change. Americans who live in urban areas are particularly worried, with 32% agreeing that it will get more difficult to stay where they are. In rural areas, on the other hand, only 1 in 10 agrees with that statement. But no matter how you slice it, climate migration could have a dramatic impact on the nation's economy, culture, and demography, says Mallory Newell, a VP in Ipsos's public affairs team. And extreme weather becomes more severe and frequent, those who can't afford to move or are otherwise unable to relocate, such as lower income or disabled Americans, will be disproportionately vulnerable to the worst effects. She says, quote, "The clock is ticking to prepare for and mitigate the effects of a changing environment." The future of many cities is being threatened by climate change, whether by long-term effects or extreme weather catastrophes. It makes running a city all the more challenging, especially when navigating infrastructure plans, urban planning, housing affordability, and inequality. West Palm Beach, Florida is one of the US cities most vulnerable to climate change. And for Mayor Keith A. James, it takes a sense of urgency, action, and diplomacy to ensure that cities remain resilient. West Palm Beach is separated by the ocean by the town of Palm Beach and sits on the Intercoastal Waterway. That still puts it at the front line of vulnerability. As a Democrat running a city in a blue county in a red state, Mayor James faces an additional hurdle of partisan debates about climate while trying to shore up the city's resilience to it. Regardless, the urgency of climate change is a priority in everything he does, because climate change isn't coming, he says, it's here. Among the things he's doing is a vulnerability assessment study to understand what parts of the city are at most risk, which is something that everyone, including business leaders, can do. Now, cities are fascinating because they're the front line of most of our challenges. They are where we live and where we see problems directly, day to day. So mayors have to find solutions and work together with everyone they can. As Mayor James says, potholes don't have a party affiliation. But mayors can't solve those problems necessarily without help. As we talked about with GM's Hassani, funding exists from other sources. It's just a matter of finding it and using it appropriately, and being willing to start projects your successors will get to finish. Mayor James told Kate that old chestnut about how the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago and now. Here's what else he had to say.
We may be planting trees today under whose shade we will never sit. But that should, if you're a true leader, you can't let the timeline dictate the propriety of the decisions. I may say we need to build a road here, which once you get through planning and design, et cetera, I may be out of office by the time it's built. But if it's the right thing to do, you have to start the process because it is the right thing to do. We try to be as proactive as possible, working with our state and federal legislatures and taking advantage of the opportunities, whether it's grants, funding opportunities that are there. We can't hide behind party lines. I, as mayor, cannot. Our vulnerability to climate change does not turn on whether you're Democrat or Republican. I'm running a city, and so I have to do everything I can as the mayor of this city to make us as resilient as we can and to be as proactive as we can to reduce our carbon footprint. And so we have to continue to be collaborative and work with our friends and talk to those who may not be as friendly to plug away at some of these issues.
Like it or not, our cities and states are becoming more political, potholes aside. An influential book called The Big Sort talked about how people are clustering politically and how if you don't like the politics of where you live, you should just move to somewhere else. Ipsos data shows that politics aren't much of a factor in where people choose to move. Yet. But here's a counter idea. Fewer than 1 in 4 Americans say that politics is top of mind when they're thinking about areas they would choose to live. But perhaps we should. The idea wouldn't be to live near people like you, says Chris Jackson, who leads our public polling practice, but to move to places where people think less like you. That could make more swing districts. The political sorting of where we live has contributed to bad knock-on effects from impossible cost of living and challenges in cities to weak job prospects and, quote, deaths of despair in rural areas. It also has turbocharged a political system with lopsided effects. If more urban professional workers chose to move out of the expensive major cities and move to smaller towns across the country, it could have multiple positive impacts. For the individual, lower cost of living in a quieter environment. For the community, the income these high-paying knowledge economy jobs bring, which would flow into the rest of the town. And for the country, it might make more purple districts. Cities, as they currently function, do rely on a steady diet of office workers to survive. Those workers pay rent and buy lunches and other things and keep buildings and businesses afloat. Kay Sargent is the director of workplace at HOK, a leading global architecture, design, and engineering firm. She thinks 2 things will continue to upset that ecosystem: hybrid work and virtual spaces. So how do we design cities for the future? And can virtual spaces learn from physical design? Sargent thinks that in the future, it won't be hybrid work anymore. It'll just be work. And she thinks that cities need to evolve to make that happen. As more people have virtual meetings, Sargent thinks that designers from both the physical and digital worlds can learn a lot from each other. But she says, we're not there yet. The usefulness of a virtual or physical space is partially dependent on how the humans react to it and process the information in it. And she says we need to be able to read each other and read the room, literally. Architects have studied this for centuries, and we need to apply that thinking for virtual spaces to thrive and be thrived in. Kay and I met at South by Southwest, where she sat on a panel about metaverse design with 2 other people you've heard from in the pages of What the Future, Kathy Hackle and Paramount's futurist, Ted Schilowitz. Here's what she told me when we chatted for this interview.
When you hire an architect to design your space, you're hiring them for their expertise and their training and their understanding about how to put that space together in a way that will lead to the best experience for the user. Right now, there are a lot of people that are designing spaces virtually or in the metaverse that don't have that same type of sensitivity about sensory processing, the overload. And so a lot of these spaces that you're going into are just sensory assaults There are videos that people send me and I can't even get halfway through it because I start getting nauseous or dizzy, right? Because you can do so much that people just tend to just do it all. And it's this ridiculously overblown, cartoonish, chaotic type of world with all kinds of crazy things going on. And most people can't process that actually very well. In fact, it actually is overwhelming to a lot of individuals. And there's no control right now. There's no, how do we design a space that actually will be either calming or soothing and just not this vicious assault on our senses? There are some people that are absolutely doing that and embracing that, but there are a lot of people, anybody can go in there and do it, and you don't have to have any training or any sensitivity. Right now, it's a free-for-all in many cases, and that's not necessarily good.
The tension between design for physical and virtual spaces, or between fun and functional perhaps, is an interesting one, but not one we dove into for the tensions of this issue. But we'll use that as a segue anyway. That said, let's do the tensions. So what are tensions? Tensions are the kind of bits of human opinion that are going to help us tell where the future is going. And when we think about one of the outcomes of foresight work, scenarios, we think tensions are a useful way to determine which scenario we might be headed for and how that might change over time. So we set this up with a series of forced choice questions, and we ask people where we are today. Do you want this thing or this thing? Do you think this thing will happen or that thing will happen? And the cool thing is, being researchers, this is something we can measure over time. And we can think about, as we move one way or the other on that line, potentially in the future, what kind of future is that signaling towards us in terms of where we are all headed? Today, we're going to walk through several of them. The first is the obvious tension between work from home or return to office. And given the choice, we would rather work from home than return to the office. In reality, most people can't make that choice unilaterally. As we said, about 50% of people have some sort of flexibility in where they work or when they work. But for those who can, most experts think our future is hybrid. And that's an issue for the future of cities, but it's going to take more than just adjustments to the cities themselves. Office equipment, for instance, will have to enable hybrid. As HP's Martin Schwartz says, that's a potential pain point for B2B customers that software and hardware makers need to address. He says, we design many of our products for hybrid where workspace aware or spatially aware, or we allow for seamless transitions between workplaces. He says, but many of these workers will still need to collaborate, still need to connect with their coworkers through collaboration sessions and through conferencing. Tension 2, which we also alluded to earlier, is the tension between where we live. Do we live in the cities or do we want to live someplace outside of the big city? And at the moment, 74% say that we do not want to live out downtown. We are a largely suburban and exurban nation in population and rural in land use. But is that sustainable? Probably not. Few people, if any, signal that the future is adding sprawl to our urban metros or density in far-flung rural communities. So if we're going to continue commuting, how do we make that more sustainable? EVs have to be part of that solution. GM's Hosasani says that EVs can be part of the solution for sustainable transit, as well as helping to prop up our aging electrical grid. He says, utilities and states are going to be very motivated to have people driving EVs because it's a solution to the problems plaguing the grid in the US. Tension 3, Morehouse or shorter commute. And this tension is about two macro forces that are driving change: inequality and climate change. Typically, the farther from the city you go to live, the cheaper the housing is, which also means that the longer your commute is. And that essentially ties affordable housing to vehicle emissions. And that won't lead to a good future for anyone. We accept the longer commutes because that's the world we've built for ourselves. But what if we build a better world with more precincts, as HOK's Kay Sargent suggests, or more density, as urbanist Gil Penalosa and pretty much every other urbanist says we need? Penalosa says, when people talk about density, they think about Manhattan, and when they talk about no density, they think about Houston. And he says there are better options than Manhattan or than Houston, somewhere in the middle. Tension 4, climate will affect me or it won't. In order to act on something, you have to believe in that something. And today we see all kinds of worrying signals about cities and climate, areas pushing for more development even without access to an assured water supply, insurers pulling out of cities and states due to rising risks of extreme weather, building booms in areas that are projected to be underwater in coming decades. These are all things that are happening right now, and today we're split on whether we think climate change is going to change where we live. But until we see those effects closer to home, we're unlikely to change policies and behavior. West Palm Beach, Florida's Mayor Keith A. James is on the forefront of dealing with this every day, and he says resiliency will be the key. He says, quote, "We have to make sure what we're doing everything we can to respond to climate change and understand the data, based where some of the hotspots are and where we are most vulnerable." And finally, tension 5, virtual or reality. Today, most of us do not want to spend more time in 3D virtual spaces like the metaverse. There are any number of reasons why that might be the case, like expensive hardware, not enough use cases for a lot of folks. But one thing that could shift is if our physical and digital spaces work together better and their designers learned from each other. When HOK's Kay Sargent thinks of design, she's thinking of the practical functions a space serves, as well as the effects and experience it can have on people. She thinks both physical and digital spaces need to rethink to meet future needs. She says, quote, "We need to understand that in the virtual realm, we are impacted by what we are seeing and experiencing in those spaces, just like we do physically." Now, imagine we've come up with a couple plausible scenarios, and we do this in the issue, and you are welcome to go check those out. The handout is in your control panel, or you can always visit future.ipsos.com and see all of our What the Future issues. So we've created these scenarios, and then Ipsos takes those scenarios and spins the traditional jobs to be done framework for innovation into future jobs to be done. And this builds on the theory that people buy products and services to fulfill certain needs or accomplish specific tasks. For instance, we don't buy an apartment, we hire it to nurture us and our loved ones and give us shelter and create a space of our own in a busy world. So to bring that into the future, with our Trends and Foresight team in Strategy 3, we envision powerful and plausible scenarios through strategic foresight. And while many needs are enduring and do not change over time, the context of that job will change, along with potential solutions and alternatives. So these scenarios help us define the circumstances in which people may find themselves, like considering whether to stay in a city that depletes our savings or retreat to more suburban pastures that offer less immediate proximity to our communities. We use future jobs to be done to tie these scenarios to actions that organizations can take to help people meet future needs. While it's typical in Foresight to create these in clusters, we're going to share one scenario here as an example. So imagine a world where we need to help me enjoy, thrive, and connect to others in urban spaces. In a world where many are being priced out of their neighborhoods and prefer hybrid lifestyles, people still need resources and motivations to continue living in cities. So there are future jobs to be done around helping me be part of and contribute to an inclusive urban community, or providing me with the resources needed for mobility as I navigate around effectively for both cost and time, or help me thrive financially and find affordable housing, or give me access to culture and new experiences that broaden my horizon. And imagine a world where a government environmental justice task force is rolled out across US area metros to improve health and well-being for city dwellers. And one other way we like to think about the future is in terms of the gaps we see between the future we want and the future we expect we are going to get. People agree mostly on how they want to experience city life. More often than not, they don't agree that they're going to get the life they hope for. Overwhelming majorities want our cities to be safe and affordable, where climate change doesn't affect where they live, where local politics are united, and where people shape their community to their values. Yet we're split on whether we want to work from home or at the worksite, or office, or whether cities are built for public transportation or cars. And the gaps on many of these dimensions are significant. We expect housing to be expensive, communities to be divided, and people to commute to their office in their cars. But these gaps offer opportunities for change and opportunities to help your constituents, your consumers, your employees, your shoppers, your consumers, to help them get to the future they want. And I gotta say, we're redesigning this page for future issues, and it's gonna be even cooler. I can't wait to show you. And speaking of things that are coming up, our next issue of What the Future is gonna drop in just a couple weeks. You can join us for the webinar version of this. And our next version is unfortunately way more timely than we wanted, the future of war. And while we are taking that from a future of war perspective, we are also looking at how the challenges facing the future of war and the future of defense are the same challenges that most organizations and people are facing. Challenges about supply chains, about managing risk, about making sure that you are skilling your workforce properly for the future. These are all things that businesses are facing today, and we're going to talk about those in the context of the increasing global instability that we are seeing. It is a fantastic issue, and we have an amazing group of people we are talking to, including our first sitting US member of Congress. It's going to be a great issue, and if you want to get it, all you have to do is subscribe. This little QR code will get there. You can also sign up at future.ipsos.com. And you will get a once a month email from us as we drop each issue. So our remaining 2 issues for this year are the future of war, and then to really lighten the mood in a whole lot of different ways, we're doing Teen WTF. And that is also going to be pretty fantastic. We are going to lean into the teen magazine as both a design and editorial aesthetic, and we cannot wait to share that with you. So why do we do all of this? I'm going to close the way that I always close, that when you imagine possible tomorrows, when you stop to think back, and you've just taken 45 minutes to think about the future with me, and I thank you so much for that time. But when you give yourself that time, you give yourself the chance to think about the world in the future, and think about those future jobs to be done, and think about how your consumers and customers are going to live, and employees in this case especially. And you can start to imagine that world. And then from there, you can imagine what kind of research you'll need to do to measure that world, what kind of innovation you'll need, what kind of products, what kind of messaging you'll need, what kind of creative, what their user experience and customer experience will be. And therefore, when you imagine possible tomorrows, you're going to ask better questions today. You're going to do better research. You're going to have a better idea of how to plan for the future that you want. So thank you everybody for coming out. We'll be here again next month. It looks like November 2nd will be the Future of War webinar. The issue will drop in the meantime. We can't wait to have you with us. Thanks again for your time. I'm Matt Carmichael, editor of What the Future, and I'll see you in the future.